Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to our webinar that we'll be having this afternoon entitled Inviting Neurologists in, Broadening Who Conducts and Participates in Clinical Trials. I'm Dr. H.E. Henson. I am the chair of the Clinical Research Subcommittee, and I'm really pleased to be joined by three panelists who I'll introduce in just a moment. Before we get started, we have just a few announcements. Next slide, please. First off, just a reminder of the mission and vision of the Academy. This is familiar to most all of you, but it's always important to come back to our values every time we start an activity. Next slide. So today's discussion, as you might have gleaned from the write-up, will be about conducting clinical research outside some of the traditional academic structures, and this will include private practice, affiliated hospitals, and rural areas. We're going to talk a little bit about how clinical trials are conducted in the community, and then also hopefully illuminate some resources for those of you who are interested in doing this in your own practice setting, and especially with some emphasis on finding mentorship if you are not in a well-resourced academic center. Next slide. Before we get started, however, would really like to understand a little bit better who's joining us in today's call. And so you'll see in the chat that there is a quick poll. And what we're trying to learn is, first, what's your career level? And then second, what region do you live in? This will just help us understand a little bit about the attendees, and then also how we can better serve the listeners of today's webinar, as well as, for future educational resource opportunities that we might offer within the Academy moving forward. So if you don't mind just for a moment filling that out, both your career level as well as the region that you live in. Give folks a second to do that. And then we can go on to the next slide. Just as I mentioned, I'm Dr. H.E. Henson. I'm a neurointensivist practicing in Portland, Oregon at Oregon Health and Science University, but I'm coming to you today really under the auspices of the Clinical Research Subcommittee, which is a subcommittee of the Science Committee, which I'm pleased to serve on. And I'm joined by three panelists, Dr. James N. Goldberg, Dr. Alyssa Thomas, and Dr. James Stevens. What I'm going to do to give this group a little bit of an introduction to our three esteemed panelists is tell you a little bit about each of them, and then also offer each an opportunity to tell you, the audience, about their areas of expertise. And I'm hopeful that this will help you formulate some good questions for each of them that will be helpful to you as you contemplate how you might integrate clinical research into your specific circumstance or practice setting. So, just going in order, I'm going to start with Dr. James N. Goldberg. He is a board-certified neurologist who practiced in Palm Beach County for 25 years. He currently serves as the Chief Medical Officer of Headlines Research, a North American clinical trial company. And so Dr. Goldberg has extensive experience in conducting clinical trials in private practice. And so I'm going to turn it over to him to tell you a little bit more about his area of expertise. Dr. Goldberg.
Yeah, thanks so much for the introduction. Thanks for having me. I think this is a really great topic. I'm a private practitioner, and as was introduced, spent about 25 years in the clinic, and along that way decided that I would sort of diversify what I did. And one of the things that was of interest to me was really clinical trials, really for the scientific and academic interest of what was being studied, cutting edge medicine and therapeutics, also for the access to my patients. Early on in my career, I'd seen them done obviously at academic centers, but was invited in by somebody in the community who offered me some mentorship and advice early on. And in our practice, we started clinical trials in a single exam room. And that exam room spread to several exam rooms and 500 square feet of adjacent space, and then 5,000 square feet, and really sort of evolved to the point where many years down the road, we partnered with Headlines Research, which is a clinical trial network in North America with multiple freestanding private independent sites, and my role now as Chief Medical Officer. And so really have transformed my career from what would really be a standard private practice to becoming a clinical trialist full-time. These opportunities are available. They're a little bit hard to find. I think training and mentorship is key, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that in this webinar. We do that for folks that are in the community as we invite them in. And there really are three ways to participate in clinical trials. Either you refer to a clinical trial, or you help run a trial as a sub-investigator and principal investigator. And each of those tracks are hopefully things that we'll talk about today, so all of you can consider them if you're not doing them. They're all important, right? We don't get new medicines and advanced therapeutics if we don't put people in clinical trials. Multiple studies look at where patients come into the clinical trial funnel from. And I would say from what I've seen, on average, 50% of them come from private research centers and non-academic institutions. So when this goes well, in the private practice world, the patient benefits. They get medicine they might not get otherwise. Their care is usually provided for free. Community may benefit, become healthier. Society may benefit as new medicines and therapies are discovered. And personally, I think there's been a tremendous benefit for me as I participate in this. And again, when it goes really well, good things happen. And I can share with you that most of the clinical trials in our network are focused in CNS, but we do vaccines as well. And we put the first patient in the United States in the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine trial in a private research center. And two of our principal investigators were authors on the New England Journal article that published those results. So by way of introduction, a brief snippet of my career and a little tease for some of the opportunities and ways that folks can get into research outside of the academic institutions.
Scrambling to unmute myself. You would think by this point in the in Zoom world, it would be a little faster, but there's still a learning curve. That's perfect. I just want to encourage attendees that you can use your Q&A portion at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for any of our panelists at any time. So please do feel free to go ahead and start sending those questions in. I'd like to introduce our next panelist. This is Dr. Alyssa Thomas. Dr. Thomas is a neurologist and neuro-oncologist at the University of Vermont Medical Center and an assistant professor at the Larner College of Medicine at UVM in Burlington, Vermont.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, Dr. Hinson, and to the Academy for supporting this. So as you said, I'm a neurologist and neuro-oncologist in Vermont, and one of my interest areas is service to a rural patient population, and in particular, trying to increase clinical trial access in rural areas. So Vermont's a unique place, as many of you probably know. About 19% of the United States is considered rural, and over 80% of Vermont is considered rural. So our patients are generally from rural towns, and we have a large rural patient population. And we're the one academic center in our state. And so though I am centered in an academic institution, a lot of the clinical trials work that I've been involved in has been outreach to some of our affiliated hospitals as well as to community hospitals, and trying to build networks and connections to patients within their own communities. I think one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this is there's a lot of data to show that patients from rural America have worse healthcare outcomes across a full spectrum of diseases, and cancer is one of the areas that's often highlighted in this. But clinical trials are one of the opportunities to help improve and match and normalize those outcomes. And there's some really nice data from large clinical trial networks that try to serve rural patient populations that show rural patients involved in clinical trials actually have the same outcomes as urban and metropolitan patients in clinical trials. And so when given access to the same level of care, the same standardized care, and this kind of cutting edge research, we can really improve healthcare outcomes for these rural patient populations. I think there's a lot of challenges in this area. Access, travel, geography all play in, and so does understanding and perception. And so, if you're like me and interested in connecting with patients I think it's really important to understand the local communities and what the challenges and the barriers are. I've learned a lot here about travel across Lake Champlain and how much of a difference a ferry pass can make versus driving around a lake to try to reach a clinical trial site. A lot of barriers around winter travel. And so I think starting to talk to patients and do community outreach is really helpful. There are some really nice survey studies across clinical trials that show sometimes patients from rural areas have very different perception about clinical trials than patients in more urban areas where they're seeing this on the news and hearing about it in their institutions all the time. And so I think there are opportunities, as Dr. Goldenberg said, to refer and promote and just sort of talk about clinical trials within your area, as well as to really establish clinical trials within your institution, whether that is connecting to larger, multi-center studies and becoming a sub-investigator, or developing trials in your area. And I think particular to the rural patient population, thinking about some pragmatic clinical trial design in both trials you choose to open or trials you're trying to design for your area becomes really important, because every additional trip to the doctor's office, every extra mile of travel, is a potential obstacle for patients living in some of these more remote areas. So I look forward to the conversation and kind of talking about where opportunities are for mentorship and involvement.
That's really well said. Thank you so much. Well, to our third panelist, who kind of almost needs no introduction, but I will introduce anyway. Dr. James Stevens is our immediate past president of the Academy, and he has been a private practicing neurologist specialized in sleep disorders medicine at Fort Wayne Neurologic Center for the past 32 years, and actually has extensive experience in conducting clinical trials in private practice as well, and really understanding and bridging the gaps between academics and private practice and how those collaborations might work. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Stevens to say more.
Great, thank you, Holly. And that, as you heard from Holly, I'm a private practicing neurologist in Indiana. And that actually, boy, I wish it were only 32 years. I'm up to 35 going on 36 right now, Holly. And that I've been a comprehensive, this is Jim Goldenberg, a tip to him, neurologist for that time, as well as have a board certification in sleep disorders medicine, do that as well. But because of seeing everything from soup to nuts in neurology as a comprehensive neurologist, I've had a wonderful opportunity to participate in many clinical trials. I started in the early 1990s, and to date I've been involved either as a sub-investigator or principal investigator in over 200 clinical trials. And it spanned the breadth, everything that you can think of from, I started with acute stroke. And so I've done both in hospital as well as in the clinic trials. And over the years, done things in autoimmune disorders, MS, multiple sclerosis, NMO, Alzheimer's. Done things with muscular dystrophy, also epilepsy, headache, and many others. And it's really been a wonderful, as you heard from the two other panelists, experience, because you offer something to your community, to the patients. And I've gotten to be involved, boy, back in the 90s in the seminal TPA trials and the CREST trials, other things that at the end of the day make a big difference for the management and outcomes of our patients. So it's been incredibly satisfying over my career to have that as a part. And that one of the things that neurologists all face along the way is the dreaded burnout or not being able to have the energy to get up and do our job. And clinical trials has been a wonderful thing in my practice, and keeping the intellectual interest and patient engagement, et cetera. So many benefits along those lines. And it creates a little bit of a diversion, if you will, from a routine that you can add that keeps things fresh. And so I found it incredibly rewarding on many different levels. Currently, we have 4 full-time clinical research coordinators who work in my practice. And that, boy, when I started out, it was pretty much a word of mouth that if you knew somebody who had an interest in a trial, or if you read from the NIH or NINDS, hey, we've got something going on, then as a private practitioner, I would have to reach out and say, hey, what do you think? And the reality of it is that I served for a while on a board, on a panel with the NINDS, because recruitment was a big, big issue. And private practice seemed to be a very logical place to try and mine, because when you look at it, and this is just the nature of the beast, when you're at an academic center, you may be doing your own personal research, teaching, etc. And so the number of patients you see per day is probably a lot less than the person who's in private practice, and the number of patients they see with certain diseases per day who could be eligible for a clinical trial. And so I worked with the NINDS. We used our site as well as many others across the country to prove the concept that for recruitment into trials, that having private practicing groups or neurologists makes a lot of sense. So from the personal reward standpoint, patient benefit standpoint, and really from the economics of having a private practice and the way medicine has gone, it's also served as a valuable adjunct, if you will, at keeping my lights open and employing lights on and employing people from participating in clinical trials. So a lot of pluses. So thank you. And I also look forward to answering questions and having further discussions.
Well, perfect. This is so exciting. And I want to encourage all of our attendees to please place your questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to posing those to our panelists. But before we get started, I'd like to pose the first question to each of you, actually, and we can sort of maybe go in that order that we just did. But let's say that you're either in private practice or in a more rural area. How do you get started? Like, what is the first way that someone that's maybe just a couple of years out from their training, they've established their clinical presence in their community, and now they're thinking, gosh, I really want to do this. I'd really like to bring some of these trials to my patients. What is the first step? How do you get started? I'll start with you, Dr. Goldenberg.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways. The barrier to entry from private practice can be a little bit higher, so it's good to sort of get everybody on the panel's opinion here. I think the first way is to refer a patient to a clinical trial, right? So if there's a clinical trial going on in your area, your city, your region, perhaps at a clinical trial center or a university near you, when you send that patient to the clinical trial, you'll get a sense of how it works from the referring physician standpoint. You'll also see what it looks like through your patient's eyes. You'll get a chance to judge, the effort and the potential benefit of what it looks like. And you may become familiar with clinical trials and may even get to collaborate a little bit. The second thing I can think of is if you know somebody that's an investigator in a clinical trial, that would be your contact person. That would be your entry point. That would be potentially your mentor. And again, that can be anybody that you know locally, regionally, or nationally, or somebody that you're introduced to from the academy that's doing a clinical trial, and you ask them, how does it work? What are the contexts? What's the first thing I need to do? The third thing I can think of, and this happened a little more frequently back in the day, is there are interactions that we have with pharma companies, right? And so you can express your interest to a representative of a pharma company that you may meet in your office, in your hospital, at a meeting or a dinner in your community, at a sponsored event at an organization. And that pathway is long and hard because those folks don't usually have direct input into clinical trials, but they can introduce you to somebody or make a contact or refer you to somebody within their organization that does do clinical trials. And the only other thing that I can think of, so I'm anxious to hear everybody else's response, and I want to steal all the thunder, is just to learn about the business. And so there's many ways to do that, right? There are conferences and online learning opportunities that happen frequently. And so you can learn about clinical trials from the comfort of your own home like this on a Zoom call, or you can go to a conference that's specifically designed and aggregates people that are in the clinical trial business. So I'll pause, hoping not to have stolen too much thunder from my colleagues.
Either Dr. Thomas or Dr. Stevens, points to add? How do you get started? It's daunting, right?
It's daunting. I think it's a really good question. And I wear two hats as a neuro-oncologist, but also as a neurology residency program director. And so I think for me, I knew I was interested in learning about clinical trials very early when I was a resident and fellow. And I think some of those early exposures were really things that put me in a position to think more about what questions should I ask once I came into my own career. And so I guess maybe I'll touch on this question about getting started from some of those very early touch points in training where you may have easy access to people who are already doing trials. I think the more protocols you can read, the better. If you have a chance at all to get your hands on a protocol, to be a reviewer at some level, whether it's for your division or your department or your own institutional review boards, just starting to understand what makes a good trial, what makes it well written, what makes it feasible is really helpful when you're thinking about becoming a PI or a sub-I on a study. I think the more you have opportunity to interact with patients who are contemplating trials is helpful. So sitting in on an informed consent conversation, hearing, how does somebody actually present trial information to a patient, just starting to learn, how do you make this accessible to patients rather than this big daunting becoming a guinea pig black box, right? I think there's an art to introducing clinical trials, and the more you can observe informed consent discussions, the better. And then what I tried to do when I was a trainee was to think about trials for any patient I was seeing. So if I was seeing a patient who is started on a new medication, like, what would I list as adverse events to medications? Would I attribute this to being caused by the medication or not? How can I start to tease that apart? How do I think about how severe a side effect or a reaction is? Because if you're going to be the PI, you're going to be responsible for reporting all of these things. And so starting to think about approaching patient care in that way, I think is a nice entry point, as well as thinking about eligibility. When you're seeing a patient who needs a new treatment, do you have access to an eligibility checklist and can think about starting them on, this standard of care versus this trial, just kind of in the patients you're seeing in your own clinics. So I think not everybody has the luxury of that exposure, but if you are training in an institution that has PIs and that has trials open, just getting the early exposure certainly paves an easier path forward for that first time you want to take the reins and try to be a PI on something.
Well, I think that beautifully addresses one of the first questions in the Q&A, which is how one might prepare when they're in training, either in residency and fellowship, to when you get done with training, to go out there and to be a PI. And I just want to take a moment to disambiguate the ideas of investigator-initiated studies. So study questions that one comes up with oneself and then design studies around, versus being, for example, like a site PI for a multi-center clinical trial that you yourself are not coming up with the question necessarily, but you're playing a vital role in participation in that clinical trial, in that you are enrolling subjects at your own site, you're monitoring them, you're really the guardian of these patients as they move through that clinical trial space. I think there is a misconception sometimes in clinical research that the only type of research that is done is investigator-initiated studies. And we all know that's not necessarily true. And perhaps there's a broader realization of that. But I want to say to the trainees that are on the call that being a an investigator sort of initiated, you're the one who's coming up with all the research questions. That's not the only way to make a very meaningful impact in clinical research. And so other thoughts from other panelists about things to do in training to get yourself ready, because you're not necessarily going to stay at the academic institution, you're going to go out there into the real world, but how can you get prepared to be the best you can?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing like being a participant and that you can do that. I think there's probably a lot of opportunities with your mentors or people on faculty who are conducting clinical trials to just say, hey, I'd like to help, or I'd like to volunteer and help. And that actually we have a lot of medical students now who during their summer months, or even some college students who come in and work with us on the clinical trials because they're very interested about it. Getting back to the first question, there's no doubt there's a lot of rules, and it's a different ballgame if you've never done a clinical trial, all the way from reading about good clinical practices, figuring about, the IRBs, figuring out a budget, figuring out, what documentation has to be done and how that best can be done. But to start out, I totally agree with Jim as far as initially, if you're already out there referring patients, but if you're at an academic center, volunteer to help or assist with a clinical trial that one of your academic teachers are participating in. I think you can learn a lot that way. The other thing I was going to mention that wasn't mentioned in the beginning, that, when I started on this venture, it was pretty much someone I knew saying, hey, I'm doing this trial, et cetera, and that, oh, can you participate? Would you like to participate? But now electronically with data mining, et cetera, there are people who are coming to you saying, hey, I've got a trial going on, your patient might be eligible. And that, for example, within the academy, our registry is doing that in a de-identified way right now. So you might get a little message or something else about referring a patient in that way. So, but to get back to your second question or the initial question from the audience, I'd say, boy, just seek out what clinical trials are going on in your institution, within your residency program, and just ask, hey, can I help? And that you'll learn a lot just by getting in and doing a bit of that work.
Perfect.
And I just add to that, good clinical practice, Jim mentioned, is not just 3 words strung together. It's the industry term for the way we conduct ourselves. And that course, those basic courses available again online, inexpensively, perhaps even free, starting at 2 hours, will walk you through really all the things that you need to know about conducting a clinical trial. So I really think that's a great resource, GCP, Good Clinical Practice. And the other tips were great. I think talking to the people with, and this goes to another question in the Q&A, talking to the people that have other roles, talking to not just the PI, but it would really serve you well to have a conversation with a coordinator, a research assistant, a regulatory person, and just get a little understanding of the kinds of different roles that go into a clinical trial, because the PI, the principal investigator, delegates to all those people. That would be another good way to prepare yourself as you're thinking about your future in clinical research.
Yeah, that's absolutely great. I know nobody loves to do online modules. I know I just had to do several myself, and they can be a pain, but the content of particularly that of good clinical practice and that human subjects research, that's the other one that we're routinely can do to prepare for this type of work. I mean, it's essential. I mean, we just really have to have some basic competencies to make sure that we're good stewards for our patients and we care for them well. So it's while it's sort of a necessary one of those things you just have to do, but there's some good material in there for sure. I'm going to combine a couple of the questions because I think this is really incredibly important. So you are in your practice setting and you don't necessarily have the infrastructure of like a really well iterated academic program. who do you need? Who are the key players that you need to conduct a trial well? One of the attendees had said, what is sort of the bare minimum in terms of basic staff? What are the key roles that must be done aside from the principal investigator themselves at their site in each of your opinions? And we can actually talk about practice, rural setting. I mean, I think it probably varies a little bit, but depending on your institution, but I'd like to hear from each of you about sort of what you think would be, essential, to conducting that. If anyone wants to jump in, Dr. Thomas, I'll just call on you just to put some structure.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. This is a very layered question. I think before even thinking about the personnel to run the trial is thinking about your own resources to carry out the standard of care being asked for in the trial, right? So do you have reliable pharmacy support, imaging support, laboratory access, clinical space to conduct whatever is being asked for in the protocol that you're reviewing? So the kind of clinical patient care facing basics, I think, are the first step. And any sponsor is really going to look to that at a site visit at your institution, just to make sure that your institution actually can meet the standards of care being asked for. And then, to support a patient through a clinical trial, as well as to support the principal investigator through all of the regulatory process, having a clinical research team is really helpful. I think it starts at protocol review and making sure you have access to people who can help review the scientific integrity of the trial. And for many institutions, there's some form of protocol review and monitoring committee or scientific review committee, as well as a committee that will review the human subjects ethical aspects of the trial. So an institutional review board, whether it is internal to your institution or an IRB that you can contract with and work with outside of your institution. And then I think kind of key personnel to include everybody who may touch a patient who's going to be involved with that patient's care, somebody who's going to help with the data, so a study coordinator who will help to track the consent forms and the data entry, and reviewing, all of the updates to the trial. At our institution, we have a separate data coordinator, a clinical research coordinator, as well as a regulatory coordinator. And those three roles, someone who's looking at changes to the trial, changes to the protocol, changes to the amendment, someone who's looking at the patient-facing information, like, did the patient turn in their pill diary? Did they report their adverse events? Did they show up for their visit on this date? And then somebody who's actually entering and reporting the data in real time. Those elements of the team, I think, are essential to really successfully running a trial.
Yeah. Well, how the heck are you going to pay for all this great support? Dr. Stevens, Dr. Goldenberg.
Yeah. Well, it was so interesting how I started the very first trial I did. It was an inpatient trial, and it was for acute stroke. And it was with a compound at the time, I think they called it Ancrod. Essentially, it was snake venom that we injected into patients to see. It was a, thrombolytic, if you will, kind of medicine. And the person who got me initially interested in this was our unfortunately recently departed giant in neurology, Dr. Sacco. And Ralph had called me and said, hey, would you be interested in doing this? And that I didn't have the infrastructure to do it at the time. And so I went to and read online what it would take, read the protocol. And I think for anybody, if you're going to start out on this, journey, pick something that you have a keen interest in, meaning that you think, wow, I'm really interested in this. And you feel that your local population would really benefit from participating in this. And that I'd say, just, stick your toe in the water. There's usually an investigators meeting, et cetera, where they discuss and talk about the protocols and take input as far as what they think people should do. And that I just took my nurse who worked in my clinic and said, hey, what do you think? Do you think we can do this? You think you have the time? And let's read through it. And took her with me, and we learned a lot along the way. And that's how we started and realized what we would need, et cetera. I think if you are just a solo practitioner out there or in a small group practice, I think that's kind of how you have to start to stick your toe in the water. All those other ancillary people that Dr. Thomas talked about are great, but nobody has that to start with. And that when you look through a protocol, one of the things you're going to learn to do is to see what the budget is. So maybe you can pay for people to do this work, and that you're going to have to ask for that allocation so I can get the work done. Those are just some thoughts on my.
And I'll be brief because the answers before were eloquent. Alyssa's particularly was eloquent, and I agree with everything she said. And I want to emphasize that it's the investigator's responsibility to ensure that you have adequate resources to conduct the trial. Otherwise, you can't move forward. But my story is very much like Jim's. Way back when we started our first trial by hiring one person that had clinical trial experience and then using people in our office to fill other roles. And that was the beginning of a long journey. And really, it's landed in a really remarkable place for us. So the answer is complex, but there is a way to get in with the right invitation and the right partnership, and maybe, a little effort and investigation on your part, and maybe one experienced person in clinical trials standing next to you to start with something really simple.
Well, I've definitely seen that layered. So for example, our stroke center here at my institution, which admittedly is an academic institution, have been able to simultaneously be involved in a couple of different trials, but the overlapping support has been able to fund multiple people. And so folks have been able to, instead of being your incredible nurse or the coordinator who kind of wears all the hats, they've been able, because of that overlapping financial support, to start to specialize, right? So you can designate someone as sort of the data entry kind of coordination person, another person that focuses a little bit more on the regulatory piece. And so I've definitely seen that done. And I was just going to ask you, Dr. Goldenberg, certainly where you are now, I mean, the enterprise that you all have built is really complex and like quite huge. And your group is conducting almost innumerable sort of simultaneous trials. Do you have any thoughts about how that scaled, or did it just build over many, many years, or was there a specific sort of way that that came about?
Yeah, I mean, the scale from the individual center that sort of Jim is talking about, that I'm talking about, took a number of years to get to the point where it had good infrastructure. And that journey for us probably became real at 5 or 7 years, and interesting and exciting at 10 years, and then really appealing to other people at 15 years. And so it's a long journey. The network has a lot more resources, right? And so the network that I'm in grows by partnering with individual sites with key opinion leaders like Jim Stevens, and bringing them into the network. And we also grow by starting de novo sites. So though I just told you a minute ago that my journey started with one person in an exam room, I'm talking to you today from Detroit, where we're opening a site, sitting in their office today. It's 5,000 square feet. We have 2 investigators, 2 coordinators, 2 research assistants, community engagement person, regulatory person, and more on the way. And we don't have a study yet. So it depends where you are in the journey. It depends what the resources are. And my guess is that this audience has probably a variable amount of resources from where we started to maybe as far as where I'm at right now. So partnering is another option, right? With a group, a center, an academic center, a private center that has more resources, and getting your foot in the door so that you can scale.
I think that's such an important point. And I really liked how you were talking about the time scale, because, I'm sure it comes as no surprise to anyone on this call that it just does take that time. It's not going to be something like you're going to jump from doing nothing, no trials, to like 8 trials in 6 months. That's not necessarily a realistic expectation.
Holly, can I share one other fact? And this is kind of it's an interesting fact. And I'm not sure I was going to bring it up, but you're bumping up against it right now. So we've got people listening to us that are obviously interested in leaning into it. And we know that they can refer, but if they want to do clinical trials, I think one of the mistakes that happen in non-traditional settings where you don't have a lot of backing and you're backing it yourself is that you do a clinical trial and it's interesting, as Jim said, and it's rewarding and it creates an economic incentive, but then that sort of disappears. The economic part folds into your practice or your life or something like that. And my advice, if you really want to make this work in a non-traditional setting, is keep the investment in the clinical trials and don't let it escape into a nice summer vacation or something else you want to do. And I'm just being really transparent with everybody on the call. Focus that money on the next person and a little bit bigger space and the scale that you talked about. That's the way that people succeed and they don't just dabble and leave.
Right. Well, I think that's true of other industries, right? So of course it's true in medicine as well, is that reinvestment will really pay dividends over the long haul. So I think that's a wonderful point. Something that a few of you all talked about, and I think that each of you are in a unique setting to comment on, is the idea of community engagement. I think there's such a special relationship between those that practice in the community and their patients that, of course, we have wonderful relationships with our patients and academics too. But you know, statistically, folks just see more patients, right? And you're known in the community. And how do you, I see, and well, you all should comment on this as a particular advantage because you have that really long-term relationship, that trust built. How do you approach community engagement for the buy-in of your patient populations in clinical trials? Or what's your philosophy on that?
Yeah, I mean, initially, Holly, when I started out, we would definitely go out, give community lectures to different, organizations or groups, depending what was appropriate, and present that as a possibility to consider. Now in 2023, you come into my lobby and there's rolling screens, TVs everywhere where it pops up interested in clinical trials, and that they give all the different ones that are going on and say, hey, ask your doctor or do that. And that in our exam rooms, we have a list of all the different clinical trials that people come in and say, hey, they're interested in, that they can look over. But when I started out in the community, and this is back in the 90s, when I started doing clinical trials, I would go, and whether it was the Parkinson's support group, MS support group, maybe it was just the Rotary Club wanted to hear about things, et cetera, that you take advantage of those opportunities, not only to inform them about the particular disease, but also to avail them if they're interested in the clinical trial, if appropriate.
And I would say my journey was similar, but community engagement has taken on a new meaning for us, and it really has to do with diversity and representing the community in clinical trials. Has been important for a long time. It's receiving a lot of attention right now. And since our centers are really freestanding and they're not attached to practices like they were back in the day for us or for Jim, community engagement really means going out to touch points in the community where people are. And you could name some of those pretty quickly, whether they're, religious groups or community centers or whatever. But I think in this day and age, getting creative is important about what the actual activation points are in the community. And it's not so much that you go out and you recruit a patient, because in order to get representation that is the same as the community, you have to establish trust. And that's a much longer process than putting your name on a card or dragging somebody into the office for some reason, And so education, trust, a much slower role, a different way of engaging the community, and very likely, maybe even strategic partnerships with people that either do this well and don't practice medicine full-time, but really engage with the community, would be things that I would consider to add on to Jim's comment.
Fantastic. Dr. Thomas, how would this translate to a rural area and rural patient populations? It's probably not the same density of community centers, right? In rural areas.
It's an interesting challenge because it's geographically vast. And, I think Dr. Stevens and Dr. Goldenberg touched on some of the really important direct contact with patients in their communities, in their Rotary clubs, in their local areas. I think the partnerships are really valuable as well. And, I might take a different twist on this and think about community engagement through collaborative physician engagement. So, we're in an interesting position here in Vermont because we're a small academic center, but we're the only academic center. And so taking the time to really form good open communication with all of the other neurologists in the region, reaching out to people who may want to refer in here, and just really having an open door to say, call me about any trial. If you're thinking about referring a patient, I'm happy to discuss it with you, and reaching out to all of the physicians in the local communities so that there is a pathway here, but also then for me to reach out onto a bigger pathway to centers larger than ours. So I have my own referral paths to larger and larger academic centers. And I have found that it builds a huge amount of trust with our patients to be able to say, I spoke directly with your primary care physician about you, or I can offer you this trial here, but I know of this trial there that you may also want to consider, or the trial I have here is also being offered at these other centers. So you have a sense of the larger medical community, and not that a rural patient is just being pigeonholed into the only thing they can get in that area. I hope that makes sense the way I'm phrasing it, but I think engaging directly with the patients is hugely important, but having this open communication back and forth with referring centers in, referring centers out, and the doctors are going to work most closely with, it builds trust all around.
Definitely. That is so important. I think gaining consent from a patient just is establishing that trust is essential. Like, it just cannot be done any other way. There really is no other way. No, sort of erudite lectures from us as physicians are going to convince anyone of anything. It's really that trust and that relationship. So that's beautiful. A couple of and I want to just encourage folks, if you have any remaining questions, we have about 10 minutes left in the webinar. This is flying by. I kind of don't want it to end. And so lucky to have the three of you here to be able to pepper with questions. A couple of the questions in the Q&A have to do with specific interest. And so let's just say that you're an investigator in the community. You really are captivated by, for example, the anti-amyloid therapies for dementia, or you're really interested in a particular drug class and you really want to study that thing, and you don't necessarily know of anyone else in your immediate community or the local, academic center in your town is necessarily doing this. How do you pursue your own specific interest? Do you just cold call a pharma company? How do you, what would be your advice to doing this? And that's to anyone, any of you who feel like you can tackle it.
Holly, I don't know if interest means you have a patient you want to refer, or it's something that you're interested in studying. I think the latter we've already sort of addressed, how you get into those clinical trials. But if you have a patient, right? So I've been in that situation many times before. So here's what I would do. One, I'd call my local university referral person and see if they have a study. Two, I'd go on clinicaltrials.gov, which is the site that aggregates all clinical trials, and you can type in search criteria, which could be a diagnosis or a region or any number of things. It's a really amazing resource. You get lost in there for hours. So go for a specific question and then get out again. And then the other thing I've done many times is I go to research and peer-reviewed journal articles, and I'll look to see who's the expert on that, and I will try to make a connection, either personally, which sometimes is a cold call, or through somebody else that I know, to get my patient to that expert who's likely going to have to travel if it's a complicated case. So it's kind of a local, regional, national sort of stepwise approach to make those referrals that I would consider.
Perfect. Other thoughts?
No, I think that's great. And that for those, I know a lot of academic centers, they do not allow, let's say, pharma representatives, et cetera, to come in and visit with them. But in the private practice world, yeah, they do. And that a lot of them, if you express to them, hey, I have an interest, Biogen, in your latest amyloid scarfing medication, or what else are you doing as far as future research trials? I'm interested. They'll usually pass that forward to the people who are in charge, and they'll get back with you. So that's another avenue as far as getting involved.
Got it. Perfect.
And then I'll just put a plug in for meetings. I think that's the other great way, is going to national meetings and hearing about research before it's published, asking questions, engaging with the PIs who are talking about their work. And often there's a chance to engage with pharmaceutical sponsors at meetings as well. And that face-to-face time just goes such a long way, so that then when you do reach out by a phone call or an email, it's not such a cold call. You've had one point of contact and say, hey, remember I met you at the AAN? And that I think the meetings are a really great opportunity as well.
I'll just see if there's any final thoughts as we kind of look over the Q&A, or any other last minute questions. Any parting or closing thoughts? I'll start with you, Dr. Goldenberg, and just sort of go in order.
I am very grateful to have been invited and have this discussion. I think this is really interesting, and I wish that I would have attended this webinar 20 years ago. I think it would have given me a boost, and it's been great fun. I'm just going to mention one more little thing, and it probably is a little bit more on the private practice side for those that are approaching from that angle, and that's that the liability in clinical trials is minimal to none, right? I don't know if everybody knows that, but sponsors indemnify the work that we do as long as we follow the protocol. And, that can be something that weighs heavily on people. And I'm sure when you're thinking about experimental medications and doing different things, that's crossed people's mind, but you should know that it's really not an issue in this sector of medicine. Another way, just as we said at the beginning, to diversify what you do. And so I'll just come back to that. Diversification of my day, my revenue stream was something I thought about all the way throughout my career, and this has been very fulfilling.
Awesome. What a relief. I actually didn't completely put that together. So I'm so glad you brought out that point. It's something I hadn't thought of exactly in that way. Dr. Thomas, final thoughts, other things that you'd like to share with our audience?
Just gratitude. This has been such a fun hour, and I've learned so much from the other panelists. I've been really inspired to think creatively about some of these questions, and it's been a lovely conversation, and I really appreciate being a part of it. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Stevens?
No, I'll echo Dr. Thomas's sentiments. And it was interesting when I went into private practice, I knew there were things in the academic center that I really enjoyed, and that I would hope to emulate when I went into private practice. And one of them was the academic kind of inquisitive thinking that I could do through research. And the clinical trials has fit that want, that need for me and many of my partners. And so those who still have that intellectual curiosity itch, it's a great fix for that. And I've been appreciative of that. And thank you, Holly, for leading us through this tonight.
It's truly my pleasure. I just want to thank everyone who attended so much for your comments. Please provide us feedback. There'll be an opportunity for you to share your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this webinar, or even if you didn't, please let us know how we can serve you better in the future, because we'd really like to offer more of this content for folks. It's a little bit off maybe the beaten path, but I think folks are really engaged with it, and hope to see all of you at the annual meeting. So just thanks so much to everyone for your participation, and look forward to April.